Hi, I'm Emmy, an ordinary college student. But I have a story that sometimes keeps me awake at night. A story that I keep replaying over and over in my head, trying to figure out how it all went wrong. To really understand this, I need to go back to the beginning. I was 14 when we lost my dad. My sister, Sarah, was only 9 at the time. It all happened so fast. One moment he was just driving home from work. The next we got a call from the hospital. Some drunk driver ran a red light and crashed into his car. He fought for his life for 3 long days, but the injuries were too serious. After his death, Mom was completely devastated. I remember her sitting in Dad's parents' living room, tears streaming down her face as she quietly told them, "I'm never getting married again. There will never be another like John." Her words sounded like a sentence, not only to herself, but also to us. Grandma and Grandpa, Dad's parents, were incredibly kind. They let us stay with them, helped us as much as they could, and even sent money to my mother every month so that she wouldn't have to work and could take care of us. But it was then that something in her began to change. At first, these were barely noticeable things. She became distracted, hugged me less often before going to bed, and her smile no longer looked real. But over time, the changes became too obvious to ignore. I began to notice how differently she treated me and Sarah. When we went shopping before the start of the school year, Sarah always came home with new outfits, while I was told to make do with last year's clothes. At dinner, she got a bigger piece of chicken or the last cookie. And at Christmas, Sarah got a whole mountain of gifts, and I got a couple of little things that were obviously bought at the last moment. "Mom, can I go to the school orchestra?" I asked one day, full of hope. She looked at me with a slight pity and shook her head. "Oh, dear, we just can't afford to rent an instrument right now." And then, just a week later, when Sarah said she wanted to study dancing, her mother immediately enrolled her in classes. "Of course, honey, we have to develop your talents." Even in small things, this difference was noticeable. When we both needed help with homework, Mom would immediately put everything off to explain to Sarah, while I had to figure it out on my own. If we got good grades at school, Sarah would go to an ice cream parlor to celebrate, and my excellent grades barely elicited a reaction. I've learned to live with it. Maybe it was because Sarah didn't look like her mom. She always tried to share her things with me, tried to stand up for me whenever she could. It made everything bearable. No matter what, we remained close. I liked watching her rehearse her dance routines, and she sat next to me and listened to me play on a cheap plastic notepad I bought with pocket money because we didn't have enough money for a real instrument. We were a team, me and her. No matter what Mom did or said. I was 16 and Sarah was 11 when everything changed again. It started with a routine blood test during a routine checkup. No one expected anything bad. We were sure that Sarah was healthy, because she always seemed energetic and full of life. But the test results were alarming. Additional tests followed, and the doctors exchanged glances that we couldn't understand. On that day, our lives were divided into before and after. Sarah was diagnosed with kidney failure. All the way home, I couldn't get rid of obsessive thoughts, replaying the worst scenarios in my head as the train carried me through the gray pre-dawn landscapes. It seemed to me that I was between sleep and reality, and this night, filled with anxiety, eyelids stuck together from fatigue and booming announcements about the next station, would never end. As soon as I closed my eyes, images immediately flashed before my inner eye. Sarah, tied to countless wires and tubes, pale, helpless, exhausted from endless procedures, and next to my mother, with the same expression of despair that she had on the day of her father's funeral. When the train finally slowed down before my stop, I could feel my heart pounding so hard in my chest, as if it was going to burst out. When I got out on the platform, I saw a familiar car. Mom was driving. She didn't come out to meet me, didn't even open the door until I came over myself, threw my bag in the back seat, and got in next to her. She looked empty. Her eyes, once full of life, were now red and tired, her face was drawn, and her hands were shaking on the steering wheel. "She's been waiting for you," Mom said softly, starting the engine. "The doctors say that she needs a transplant," and she took a deep breath, exhaled, as if gaining strength before saying the main thing, "and I'm not suitable as a donor." I felt something snap inside me, like an invisible thread holding me in the illusion that all this would somehow be resolved. I tightened my grip on my seatbelt, staring out the windshield at the dim streetlights passing by, and only now did I realize that my hands were shaking too. What does that mean?" I whispered, afraid to hear the answer. "It means that the only one who can help her is you, Emmy." Mom's voice was strained, but there was desperate hope in it. "The doctors and I have checked that you are suitable." It took me a few seconds to process what was said. It was inevitable, I understood, but it's one thing to hear about my sister's illness, to be there when she's ill, to support her, and quite another to realize that her life now depends on me. "Okay," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, even though my stomach was clenching with dread of what was coming. "What do I need to do?" "Tomorrow morning, examinations, tests, preparation. The doctors say the sooner the better." She said it so calmly, as if it was about a planned visit to the dentist, and not about an operation that would change my life forever. We drove up to the hospital, and Mom parked in front of the main entrance. The interior smelled of antiseptics, cold metal, and the faint aroma of coffee wafting from a coffee machine in the far corner. When I got to the right floor, I saw my grandparents sitting in the hallway. My grandfather silently got up and hugged me. His embrace was warm and strong, and my grandmother ran her hand through my hair, as she did when I was little. "She's waiting for you," she said softly. I pushed open the door of the ward and froze. Sarah was lying on the bed, pale and weak, but when her eyes met mine, a spark flashed in them. Her lips twitched into a faint smile, and she whispered softly, "I knew you'd come." I came closer, sat down next to her, took her hand and felt how cold and thin it had become, as if it was melting before my eyes. "Of course I came," I squeezed her fingers, not letting the tears get the better of me. "Did you think I'd leave you alone?" She shook her head slightly, her eyes glittered, but she blinked quickly, pushing away the tears. "I'm scared, Emmy," she whispered. I leaned closer, touched her forehead, and whispered back, "Me too, but we'll make it. As always." At that moment, I knew that no matter what happened, would not back down. I took a deep breath, but the air seemed thick as honey, stuck in my throat, not reaching my lungs. Her chest felt constricted, as if an invisible hand was squeezing it harder, making it difficult to breathe, making it difficult to think. Mom was looking at me across the kitchen table, her face cold and distant, as if she knew my answer in advance, as if it didn't even need to be said out loud. "You haven't decided yet?" Her voice was flat, but there was an icy bewilderment in it, as if my indecision was something unthinkable. I couldn't answer right away. I just pressed the warm mug to my palms, trying to somehow cling to this moment, to myself, to the remnants of confidence that I have the right to at least think about something. "Yes," I finally exhaled, my voice sounding hoarse, as if I'd just screamed in my sleep. I need time, Mom." She was silent for a moment, but then she put her cup down on the table with force, so that the coffee splashed onto the tablecloth, leaving a dark stain. "The time?" In her voice, there was the same irritation that I remembered from childhood, the same disappointment that I heard when I came home with a good grade, but not with the highest, when I asked for something that I wasn't supposed to, when I tried to remind of my existence. "You don't have time, Emmy. Sarah doesn't have time. While you're sitting here thinking, she's lying in the hospital, tied to a car that can't save her, and you're thinking about whether you need to take a little risk for your sister." I swallowed, feeling tears coming to my eyes, but I stubbornly blinked them back. "I'm not saying I don't want to help," I tried to speak as quietly as possible, as calmly as possible, but even I could hear the pain in my voice. It's just a serious decision. This is my body. I have to at least understand the consequences of this. The consequences? Mom jumped up abruptly, and the chair fell to the floor with a crash. The only consequence you should think about is what will happen if you don't do it. Sarah is going to die. She stood shaking with anger, pain, and powerlessness, and for the first time in a long time, I saw in front of me not the cold, reasonable woman she had become in recent years, but the very mother who sat broken after her father's death, repeating that she would never love again, never again she'll get married. But now it wasn't grief. It was rage. And that rage was directed at me. I stood up slowly, my hands were shaking, and I was afraid that if I let myself slip for even a second, if I let these feelings get the better of me, I would just break down. I need to think about it, I repeated, trying to stay at this point, at this fine line between fear and necessity. Mom looked at me, and there was something new in her eyes. Something icy. You've always been selfish, she said, softly, but every word pierced me like a needle. Since childhood. I've always thought only of myself. I gasped as if I'd been hit. It's not fair, I whispered, but Mom had already turned away, picked up a chair and, without saying another word, left the kitchen. I stood there, unable to move, unable to even breathe. And then, when I was alone, I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to slowly recede, as if I were standing on the edge of a precipice into which I had just been pushed. I felt my grandmother's hand gently squeeze my shoulder. Her touch was warm and soothing, like an anchor holding me in this reality where I could still breathe, think, make decisions. My mother was standing in front of us, her chest heaving with rapid breathing, her fists clenched, her eyes full of such fierce despair that I involuntarily pressed deeper into the back of the chair, but not from fear, but from the realization that she could not be stopped. You're going to get up right now and come with me. Her voice was cold, even, but there was a threat in it. We're going to the hospital. You'll do the tests. You will save your sister. She didn't ask for it. She demanded it. Grandpa sighed heavily, putting down the newspaper he was holding in his hands and looking at her over the top of his glasses. Elizabeth, he said calmly, you can't force Emmy to make that decision. A solution? Mom jerked her head, her face contorted. What the hell kind of solution are you all talking about? Her sister is dying. Do you want her to just fold her arms and watch Sarah leave? Do you support this absurdity? It's not absurd, Grandma replied calmly, continuing to hold my shoulders. It's her life. Her body. Her body? Mom stepped forward, and I saw her lips tremble. Sarah is dying, Mom, do you understand? He's dying. And Emmy is just sitting here holding onto your skirt instead of saving her sister. I felt a lump rise in my throat, too hot, too dense to swallow, but I tried anyway, even when the air suddenly became heavy, like before a thunderstorm. I don't want her to die, my voice was low, but I knew I could be heard. I want to help. I just can if I have to. Forced. Mom looked at me, her eyes darkened. Are you saying that I'm forcing you to save your sister? I nodded slowly, feeling my stomach churn with pain. I would give her my kidney if I could, I continued, trying to keep my voice level, but I'm scared, Mom. I have a right to be afraid. I have the right to at least think about it. Mom looked at me for a long time. Her chest was still rising and falling in a fast, dull rhythm, and then she suddenly laughed, short, sharp, with a note of bitterness. You're not afraid, she breathed. You're just being selfish. And again. It's a word. It hit me right in the gut, shattering me into pieces, like the plate she threw at the kitchen sink yesterday. I couldn't hear it anymore. Mom, please, Grandma tried to take a step toward her, but Mom had already turned around, grabbed her bag and threw it over her shoulder. I won't beg you anymore. I just hope you can look in the mirror when Sarah dies." And with that, she left. The silence that remained after her was thick, enveloping, like tar. I felt myself being pulled into this silence, as it penetrated my lungs, filled my chest, slowly displacing oxygen. Grandma squeezed my hand, but I couldn't look at her. I couldn't look at anyone. Mom was right. If Sarah dies, I really will never be able to look at myself in the mirror. He folded his hands in front of him, as if he was preparing to say something incredibly important, but did not know how to find the right words, and I gripped the armrests of the chair, feeling my heart pounding wildly somewhere in my throat, ready to burst out. Mom, who was sitting next to her, tensed, her fingers curled into a fist, and her lips turned into a thin line, as if she already knew that she was about to hear something that would not fit into her clear, prearranged scenario. "Amy," the doctor finally spoke, his voice soft but filled with strained caution. "We've done all the necessary tests, and unfortunately—" He paused, and I felt as if all the air in the room had thickened, becoming dense, viscous, making it difficult to breathe. "You can't be a donor for Sarah." For a moment, the world froze. I blinked, feeling something snap inside, though I wasn't quite sure what it was. "What?" Mom's voice was sharp, harsh, full of disbelief, like a whip. "Unfortunately, your tissues are incompatible," the doctor continued, looking from me to her. "The tests showed a high risk of rejection, and there are also certain medical factors that make the transplant too dangerous for both Amy and Sarah." Mom exhaled sharply, and I heard her nails scrape on the surface of the table. "That's—" Her voice broke, but she immediately pulled herself together. "This is a mistake. This can't be happening." "I understand how hard it is to accept," the doctor sighed, pushed one of the folders aside and leaned forward, trying to make eye contact with her, but Mom stared into space, not seeing, not hearing, not believing. "But we've rechecked all the indicators, and I'm afraid the situation won't change." I felt my head spinning from this strange, ambivalent feeling. On the one hand, relief covered me in a warm, enveloping wave, because the fear of surgery, of the risk of complications, of the fact that I could become a prisoner of this situation forever, finally weakened. But on the other hand, this relief was saturated with guilt, sticky, heavy, and impossible to get rid of. Mom slowly turned to me. Her eyes were full of horror, but I could see how that horror was being replaced by something else, something cold, empty, and hard, and this change made me shrink in my chair, as if an icy wind was blowing from her. "You did something," her voice was low, but that made it sound even scarier. You deliberately messed up the tests." I exhaled sharply, not immediately realizing what I had just heard. "What?" My voice was shaking. "You didn't want to do this. Did you try to get out of it from the very beginning, and now suddenly it turns out that you're not suitable?" Her lips curled into a bitter smile. "It's convenient, isn't it?" "Mrs. Fisher," the doctor frowned, but Mom had already stood up, so abruptly that the chair flew back with a bang. "I don't believe it," she hissed, looking at me with an expression that sent shivers down my spine. "You just found a way to avoid responsibility, but you know what?" She leaned closer, leaning on the table, her hair falling over her face, but I could still see something like hatred burning in her eyes. "For me, you died the day you said you needed time to think." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just sat there, digging my nails into my palms, feeling hot tears blurring my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Mom turned away, grabbed her bag, and rushed to the door, slamming it so hard that someone in the waiting room flinched. There was a ringing silence in the room. I slowly looked up at the doctor, who was looking at me with an expression of sincere sympathy. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," he said softly. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and then forced myself to stand up, feeling my legs tremble. "Me too," I replied, my voice sounding hoarse, as if I'd just been put through a meat grinder. I walked out of the office, my fingers curled into a fist. I lost my mother. But I didn't lose Sarah. And if anyone in this world truly deserved my love and support, it was her. I looked at her, feeling something inside me slowly but inexorably collapse, like a house of cards that, fluttering under invisible gusts of wind, trembles, loses its balance and is about to collapse completely. And I guess I always knew that this moment would come sooner or later, that when one day she will say out loud what I have felt for so long, but tried to deny, telling myself that this is only my pain, my resentment, my childish desire to be loved, and not the truth that is eating away at me from the inside, the truth that has now finally been spoken, and these words, "I never loved you. It should have been you," hung in the air, filling the entire space between us, until she swayed, took a step forward, straightened up, wiped the corner of her mouth with the back of her hand, where a drop of cognac remained, and in an icy voice full of contempt, clearly pronounced, stretching each the letter, as if wanting to cut them right under my skin, to make them not just a sound, but an eternal brand. "Get out." She didn't scream anymore, didn't rush around the kitchen, didn't wave her arms like a few minutes ago, when in anger she shook my things out of the chest of drawers into the suitcase, throwing them there as if she was trying to erase my very presence from this house, as if she wanted me to disappear forever. But now that I was standing in front of riveted to the spot by her cruel words, she looked at me indifferently, as if I were an empty place, a ghost, a mistake that she could finally fix. And this calmness scared me more than any screams, more than rage, more than a slap in the face, which I still felt on my burning cheek. I couldn't move, my body felt numb from it all. From the blow, from her words, from the realization that I had nowhere else to go back to, that now I had completely lost the house that had ceased to be mine so long ago, and I probably would have stood like this forever if I hadn't suddenly heard the sound of footsteps behind me, and, turning around, saw Grandma and Grandpa. Standing in the doorway, they must have arrived because they were worried, because they guessed that something bad might happen, and now Grandma, looking at my mother, at her lifeless, alcohol-soaked face, at the suitcase lying at my feet, at the slap mark on my cheek, shook her head. She came up to me, held out her arms to me, as if making it clear that I was not alone, and when I finally took a step towards her, she hugged me so tightly, as if she wanted to protect me from everything this world could bring, and I felt my chest shudder with suppressed sobs, but I couldn't hold them back anymore. I couldn't seem strong anymore, and the tears I was holding back poured out like a river, soaking the fabric of her old wool cardigan, smelling of lavender and something warm, dear, safe. "That's enough, Elizabeth," Grandpa said softly but firmly, and I heard such strength in his voice that I had never heard before. "You lost the right to this girl the moment you said those words to her, and if you have at least a drop of conscience, at least a drop of your soul, you won't dare touch her or insult her anymore." Mom just laughed, briefly, sharply, bitterly, and I couldn't see her face because I was buried in Grandma's shoulder, but I didn't even need to look to realize that she was standing with her arms folded, with that arrogant expression, with that hatred splashing in her eyes, with "It was her, I'm always right," which eventually left her alone in this house, because now there's no one else left who can love her after all she's done. "Do whatever you want," she threw, but her voice faltered, and in that tremor I suddenly heard something new, not anger, not rage, but an emptiness as terrible as her indifference, and I didn't know if she felt anything at all when she watched my grandmother take me under. Did she feel anything when Grandpa picked up my suitcase and nodded at the door, letting me know that we were leaving? Did she feel that now she was really alone, that now she had only Sarah, who was dying in the hospital, and I didn't know did she understand that, but if she did, she didn't show it, just turned away, poured herself another cognac, and I realized that now we really had become strangers, that this house, this kitchen, this table where we once had dinner with the whole family, no longer had anything to do with me, that now my life would go on without her. That I was on my own now, but when I left, I still lingered on the threshold, because despite all the pain, despite all her words, despite the slap in the face and the fact that I finally found out the truth, I couldn't just leave without saying anything, and turning around, I looked at her one last time and said softly, almost in a whisper, "Goodbye, Mom." She didn't answer. I walked out the door, leaving this house behind." She looked at me, and her eyes reflected fatigue soaked in months of pain, but through that fatigue came a warm, familiar smile that told me more than any words, because despite everything that had happened, despite the truth that we had learned, despite the fact that the world as we knew it had turned upside down, she remained my sister, and I remained hers, and no amount of test results, no amount of mom's words, no amount of mistakes from the past could change that fact. "I know," Sarah replied softly, her voice weak, but there was a firmness in it, a confidence that had rarely appeared in her speech since the disease began to consume her body. "You've always been there for me, Amy." I squeezed her hand, carefully so as not to disturb the tubes and IVs, feeling her cold, thin skin under my fingers, and for the first time in recent days, it seemed to me that a warm feeling was kindling in my chest that I had almost forgotten, the feeling that, despite everything, I was not alone, that there is someone in this world who loves me as much as I love him. We sat in the room for a long time, talking about all sorts of nonsense, as if we were trying not to touch what now hung over us like an invisible shadow, the new reality where we had to live, the reality in which our family had completely collapsed, but in which we still held on to each other, because in this we were the only ones left in the world. When the nurse came into the room, reminding me that visiting hours were coming to an end, I promised Sarah that I would come back tomorrow, that I would bring her favorite mints, which she did not have at the hospital, and that we would think together about what to do next, because I was not going to give up. I was not going to let my mom. I wasn't going to sit back and wait for a donor to appear. I was going to fight until I found a way to save her, because, unlike my mother, I knew that a family is not just blood, not just DNA, but something much more. When I returned home to my grandparents, there was silence in the house, filled with some strange relief, as if together with my mother, who has now left our lives forever, the oppressive, suffocating atmosphere that I felt all my childhood had disappeared, as if this house had finally become a place where I could breathe. "How's Sarah?" Grandma asked, coming out of the kitchen with a cup of tea in her hands, and I smiled at her, feeling a little warmer from this concern. "It's weak, but it's holding up," I replied, sinking onto the couch, feeling fatigue slowly cover me, making my eyelids droop heavily. "We will find a donor for her." Grandpa nodded, putting down the newspaper, and his warm, calm voice rang out in the silence of the living room. "We won't leave her." I closed my eyes, feeling like for the first time in a long time, I didn't have to be afraid, I didn't have to hold back tears, I didn't have to wait for another blow, because I was here, in this house, where I was loved, and where I could finally just exhale. It had been several weeks since Sarah had called me, barely able to contain the joy in her voice, when her words about finding a donor sounded like a life-saving bell at the dawn of a long night, filling me with hope that I was afraid to feel, and now I was standing in the snow-white walls of the hospital, in that very wing, where it smelled of antiseptics, silence, and restrained anxiety, and I looked at my sister, who was lying in her room, ready for surgery, ready for a new life, and for the first time in a long time I saw in her eyes not fatigue, not humility, not pain hidden behind smiles, and a real, genuine faith in the future. "You know I'm going to have to become a superhero now, right?" she joked, lazily turning her head in my direction while the nurse checked the floor. "I think I'm officially a cyborg now." I laughed, although there was still fear inside, but it was no longer as oppressive as before, because now, for the first time in a long time, we could really think of tomorrow not as another day of struggle, but as the beginning of something new. "Just try to use that as an excuse not to clean up the dishes," I replied, squeezing her hand, feeling her warmth under my fingers, feeling how fragile she was still, but not as weak as before. When the doctors came into the room, telling me that it was time to go to the operating room, I squeezed her hand tighter, trying to convey to her all my strength, all my faith, everything that I did not have time to say in words, because at that moment there were too few words, because none of them could express that what I felt. But she understood. I saw it in her eyes, in that slight smile, in the way she didn't try to pretend that she wasn't afraid, but at the same time she knew that I would be waiting for her here when everything was over. Hours passed. Every minute seemed like an eternity as I sat in the waiting room with my grandparents, while we silently drank cold coffee from vending machines, while I looked at the screen with updated information about operations, while my phone was ringing with calls, but not from anyone I could expect. Mom didn't call. I didn't ask about Sarah's condition. She didn't come to the hospital. She didn't write a word. And I realized that maybe she really chose her pride, her resentment, her anger, that maybe she had already completely convinced herself that I had betrayed her, that all her mistakes, her lies, her actions were not what destroyed our family, but it was me, my inability to turn a blind eye, my audacity, my stubbornness, and if she really thought that, then I had nothing left to fight for. When the doctor finally came out of the hallway, tired but with a slight smile, I stood up so abruptly that the cup of half-finished coffee fell out of my hands and fell to the floor, spilling the contents. But it didn't matter anymore, because his words, "The operation was successful. Your sister is in intensive care now, but everything is going well," was the only thing I needed to hear. It was several more days before I could see Sarah again, when she was transferred to a regular room, and when I entered the room, and she smiled at me despite her weakness, I suddenly realized that for the first time in months I was breathing deeply. "Well, now can you officially announce that you have an updated version of your kidneys?" I asked, sitting down on the edge of her bed, and she laughed, and that laugh was real, alive, filled with something so bright that it suddenly hurt me to realize how long it had been since I'd heard it like that. "I think so," she replied, her eyes shining, even though she still looked tired. I spent several hours with her, telling her about the latest news, about how Grandpa had bought himself an old radio again, on which he was now trying to catch a non-existent station, about how Grandma was indignantly finding out what exactly was added to hospital suits because they definitely contained something unrelated to food, about how I continue my studies, because now I have a goal, there is a meaning, there is a future that will not be determined by choices that were not made by me. About how I no longer wait for calls from my mother, because I know that she will call only then, when she needs something, but it doesn't matter anymore. Everything that was important was lying in front of me on this hospital bed, with a slight smile, with thin fingers fingering the sheet, with eyes that no longer had hopelessness in them. As I was leaving, Sarah called my name, and I turned around, expecting another joke, but her voice was quiet, serious, filled with something I couldn't immediately understand. "Thank you for staying with me," she said, her lips twitching, and tears glistened in her eyes, which she did not try to hide. I smiled, feeling warmth spreading through my chest. "I'll always be with you, Sarah. Always." And as I left the room, I knew I wasn't looking back on the past anymore. Now we had a future.